Why do they do it? Is the question that keeps so many victims of abuse stuck. Not because they're naive, but because they're trying to make sense of something that feels senseless. You want there to be a reason, a diagnosis, a framework that explains how someone who said they loved you could hurt you so deeply, so consistently, and so deliberately. But that search, that one that starts with wanting to understand, can quietly become its own kind of captivity. You go looking for answers, hoping they'll lead to change, hoping that if you can see inside their mind, maybe you can stop the harm, maybe you can fix it. But along the way, your focus shifts. You start studying their behavior instead of listening to your own pain. You try to understand them and forget to protect yourself. This is called rumination, and I just put this as a warning at the start of this video. Still, there is some understanding that can help. Not to excuse it, not to decode it, but to remind you that abuse doesn't happen by accident. It's not random and it's not caused by love. It happens because it gives the abuser something: a release, a sense of control, a way to avoid discomfort without having to change. And that pattern repeats, not because they are evil masterminds, but because it works. What you're about to hear is a perspective. It's not a diagnosis, it's not a clinical profile. It won't explain every abusive relationship, but it is rooted in lived experience and it's here to help name some of the patterns that men may face but struggle to articulate. If you've found yourself trying to make sense of someone who keeps hurting you, this video might be part of that answer. If it resonates, if it brings clarity, please don't stop here. Talk to someone, a therapist, a support group, a friend who believes you. Because no matter how clearly you understand the abuse, healing begins when you finally turn your attention back to yourself. This is Stand Again, a lived experience resource for male victims of family violence. And if you're here, thank you. But please stay with me because sometimes the answers you're being searching for aren't in their story, they're in yours. So, why do they do it? Let's explore. Abuse is not about misunderstanding, it's about utility. It gives the abuser something. They want relief, power, certainty, control, and it gives it quickly. Most of the time, it's not premeditated, it's reactive. It's their way of coping with feelings they don't know how to manage. When abusive people feel something they can't sit with, shame, guilt, fear, or grief, they find a way to hand it off. They don't regulate these feelings, they reject them, disown them, and push them onto someone else. If they feel like a failure, they might attack your achievements. If they feel shame, then they'll manufacture a reason to shame you. If they feel powerless, then they criticize until they've made you small. There's no pause, no inner voice questioning whether the reaction was fair, no moment of self reflection. Instead, they revise the memories in real time. You become the one who overreacted, they become the victim. That story helps them avoid one thing they fear most, which is emotional accountability. These patterns didn't start with you. Most of the time, they began early in families where control was survival and power dynamics were a constant negotiation. They learned to dominate before they learned to connect. And what was once a defense mechanism became their default relationship strategy. They often appear confident, certain, dominant, emotionally in control. But underneath that posturing is deep insecurity. Arrogance is often just fear in costume. Certainty is a shield for inadequacy. The more fragile they feel inside, the more controlling they become outside. And for some, there is a genuine absence of empathy. They mimic the signs, kind words, apologies, promises, but none of it leads to change. They've learned the script. They know how to sound sorry. But what they say is disconnected from how they treat you. The language of care is used as camouflage. Many abusers also lack day to day capability. They don't manage stress, relationships, finances, or emotions well in isolation. They need someone to carry the weight. to organize the household, absorb the emotion, and keep the system running. And when that person starts to resist, the abuser escalates, not because they're losing love, but because they're losing that control. So, what does that mean for you? None of this makes them powerful. They're not master manipulators. They're not playing 10 steps ahead. What you're seeing is a survival mechanism, a refusal to feel discomfort, wrapped in control. They don't reflect, they don't react, they don't rewrite the moment, so they don't have to change. And then they do it again, not because it's strategic, but because it's familiar and because it worked. But here's what matters: every time they hand off their emotional mess, the blame, the shame, the guilt, someone else has to hold it. And that someone is always you. You end up managing emotions you didn't create, carrying burdens that aren't yours, cleaning up damage you didn't cause. You become the shock absorber for their dysfunction, not because you're weak, but because you care, because you're trying to make it work. And that's what makes it so confusing. Because in healthy relationships, support is a good thing. You do share the load, you step up when your partner is struggling. But this isn't support. This isn't mutuality. This is transfer. The dumping of all responsibility, all regulation, all repair onto your shoulders. And when you stagger under the weight, they call you the problem. That toll accumulates. You don't just feel tired, you start to feel broken, confused, anxious, disconnected from yourself. You doubt your instincts, question your worth, and begin to treat survival as success. And all the while, they stay centered, emotionally practical, even morally, because you're the one absorbing the cost. When someone refuses to reflect, they refuse to grow. And if you stay too close to that, if you keep waiting for change that never comes, you start to reshape yourself around their limits. You soften your voice, you edit your truth, you begin to adapt to dysfunction, even though it's not your job to manage it. Over time, you stop seeing the person you used to be. You stop recognizing your own boundaries, your own needs, your own beliefs, because you've been living in response to their chaos for so long. You forget that your life is meant to have its own center, and it isn't them. You don't need to understand them to validate what you have experienced. You don't need to fix them to justify walking away. You don't need to keep carrying their emotions to prove that you care. You only need to recognize this: what they're doing isn't love, and you deserve a life where safety, clarity, and calm are not luxuries, but the baseline. So, what do abusers actually get from their abuse? One of the hardest things to accept is that abuse is often effective, not for the victim, but for the abuser. It allows them to control their environment, avoid self reflection, and maintain power without ever having to grow, compromise, or repair. Abuse doesn't continue because they're unaware of the harm. It continues because the harm is functional. It gives them what they want while protecting them from what they fear. In an abusive dynamic, the abuser becomes the center of gravity. Their mood determines the tone of the household. Their version of events becomes the dominant narrative. Their needs shape the routine, the conversations, even your inner world. You're no longer living in partnership, you're living in management mode. You spend your energy scanning for emotional threats, anticipating outbursts, absorbing blame, and modifying your own behavior just to keep things stable. That dynamic gives the abuser access to emotional regulation without ever having to regulate themselves. And when you try to hold them accountable for their emotions, they twist the situation until you're back to being the one apologizing and holding the emotional burden. They don't need to take responsibility of their emotions because they've trained you to carry it for them. Even basic adult responsibilities are often outsourced. You may find yourself doing all the emotional labor, but also the logistical organizing, the financial planning, the household maintenance, the household chores, all while being told you're not doing enough. And if you express frustration, the response isn't concern or dialogue, it's blame, deflection, or emotional withdrawal. The system ensures that they reap the benefits of a functioning relationship while leaving you holding the weight of it alone. What makes all of this so powerful is that it's reinforced by your own values. You stay because you believe in loyalty. You try harder because you want peace. You offer compassion because you care. And each of those strengths, which they are strengths, your kindness, your insight, your desire to grow, get twisted and turned against you. They exploit your willingness to reflect, apologize, and adapt while refusing to do any of it themselves. Over time, the abuse becomes a form of entitlement. They expect you to regulate their emotions, absorb their pain, clean up their mess, and do it all without asking for anything in return. If you challenge the pattern, they respond with an escalation, accusations, withdrawal, punishment, or even performative guilt, or they may try to hoover you back in, not to repair, but to regain control. It's not chaos to them, it's a system, one that keeps them safe, powerful, and emotionally unchallenged. That's why they don't change, because what they're doing works for them. They're not interested in repairing harm because harm is what keeps them in control. They're not seeking equality because superiority feels more comfortable. They're not looking for truth because the truth would require them to face themselves. And they've spent their whole lives avoiding that. Abuse isn't about misunderstanding, it's about maintenance. It maintains power, maintains control, and maintains the illusion that they are never the problem. And as long as you're focused on helping them, healing them, or understanding them, you're not asking the one question that matters most. Does this relationship support who I want to be? If you don't leave, then your life will be headed in a particular direction. So, where would your life be headed? Because some men never leave, they stay. They compromise a little more each day until there's nothing left to give away. The erosion is quiet but relentless. What starts as patience becomes paralysis. What starts as empathy becomes self erasure. I've seen it happen, I've watched it unfold in real time. My ex father in law was once a successful artist, celebrated, respected, admired by the public. But in his own home, he was none of these things. Inside those walls, he was reduced. He apologized for existing. He responded to contempt with reverence. He absorbed cruelty as though it was owed. He spoke with deference to people who treated him with open hostility, and he did it as though that was just the way things were meant to be. I remember trying to speak with him about the abuse I was experiencing. I expected some support or at least some recognition. Instead, he collapsed into blame, not towards her, towards himself. It's my fault. I'm a terrible dad. I should have been better. As though his perceived failures as a parent somehow explained or justified the cruelty of his daughter. As though abuse in his eyes was simply the price he had earned. They would scream at him for the smallest things. Watching a video on his iPad in the kitchen would be enough to trigger a tirade. Turn that stuff down, you inconsiderate prick. And he would flinch, not out of surprise, but routine. He would apologize instantly, reflexively. Sorry, 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 sorry. Like a man ducking from cover from an invisible blow. His nervous system had long accepted that this was normal. They didn't just criticize him, they humiliated him. They mocked his art, his hobbies, his appearance. They called him names that were vile and dehumanizing, even likening him to some of the worst things, repeatedly and without humor and without provocation. They brought up petty grievances from decades earlier and weaponized them as justifications for controlling what he could eat, where he could go, and how he should be treated. And he accepted it, not because he was weak, but because the strength to resist had been broken long ago. When I defended him, the punishment came swiftly. Don't you effing talk about something you know nothing about. That was the message. Any attempt to challenge the cruelty I was seeing, any effort to shine a light, was met with explosive rage. So I learned to stay quiet. He already had. By then, he had become a shell. He jumped when they barked. He sought praise from people who held him in contempt. He absorbed the abuse and internalized it as truth. I know, I'm pathetic, he would say. It wasn't self pity, it was a self definition. It was the identity that had been constructed for him, brick by brick, over years of psychological erosion. That was the path laid out for me. That's who I was being trained to become. It wasn't a hypothetical, it was a living blueprint of what happens when you stay too long in toxic and abusive relationships. And seeing it was one of the most sobering moments of my life. When you live in abusive systems long enough, the consequences go far beyond emotional exhaustion. You start to question your every thought. You lose connection to your own instincts. Your sense of self worth isn't just damaged, it disappears. And in its place, shame settles in like a fog. You feel numb, disconnected, removed from your own life. You may turn to alcohol or corn or rage. You may lash out at the wrong people or turn everything inwards until it breaks you. Eventually, you stop having needs. You stop expressing wants. You live in a kind of psychological hibernation, awake but not alive. And maybe, without even noticing it, you start craving the very chaos you've been trying to escape. That's the part people don't understand. If you spend long enough in dysfunction, your nervous system adapts to it. You get used to the adrenaline, the eggshell walking, the cycles of withdrawal intensity. Calm starts to feel threatening. Silence feels like a prelude to punishment. Peace feels unfamiliar. And before you even realize it, the damage they caused becomes a rhythm you crave. Not because it's good, but because it's what you know. You stop seeking love, you start seeking the pattern. And if no one intervenes, if you don't find a way to wake up, you'll eventually become the man who flinches, apologizes, sorry, and accepts the contempt as your due. I know that road exists. I've seen where it ends. That's why this work matters. That's why these words exist. But you are not him. And if you don't wake up, you will be. So, what happens when awakening moments occur? Awakening doesn't always arrive with certainty, it doesn't always feel empowering or bold or transformative. Sometimes it begins with a single question you can't quite silence, a flicker of discomfort you can't explain away, a sense that something isn't right, even if you can't yet name what's wrong. If you're listening to this, there's a strong chance that moment has already happened. Maybe it came in the middle of an argument that felt too rehearsed. Maybe it showed up after a moment of silence that lasted a little too long. Maybe it came not with anger, but with numbness, when you realized you no longer cared if things ever got better. Awakening rarely feels like a grand epiphany. It doesn't announce itself with clarity or force. More often, it begins quietly. It starts with you noticing the pattern you used to excuse, seeing the way your reality gets rewritten, feeling the weight of a moment that no longer sits right. And instead of brushing it aside, you stay with it, just long enough to see it for what it is. For many men, awakening begins when the impact of the abuse shows up in their children. You spend so much time absorbing the damage to protect them, but eventually you realize they've already adapted. That the very thing you thought you were managing is now their normal. That's what happened to me. There was one day in the middle of a screaming outburst when I looked at my children and they didn't flinch. They didn't cry. They didn't look frightened. They didn't stop playing. They just kept playing on, like screaming was part of the background noise. That moment hit harder than some of the worst insults I have ever heard. It showed me that abuse wasn't hidden, it had become normalized. When those moments arrive, they don't feel like freedom, they feel like disorientation. They didn't give answers, they give you discomfort. They leave you suspended between what you thought was true and what you can now feel shifting beneath you. And even when you see it clearly, the hardest part is staying with it, not retreating into denial or self blame or the need to make things okay again. Your entire coping system has likely been built around avoidance. You've learned to downplay what happened, to question your own perception, to smooth things over, to tell yourself it's not that bad. And if there's a trauma bond in place, the moment of clarity won't feel like relief. It feels like withdrawal. That's because your nervous system has been shaped by the chaos. The yelling, the silence, the warm, cold swings of affection and rejection. You've adapted to that rhythm. The highs and lows have become your emotional baseline. And when you step away from it, what you feel first isn't peace, it's panic. Stillness feels unnatural, calm feels unsafe. You miss them, not because they brought you joy, but because they brought you intensity. It's not because you're weak, it's because you're chemically bonded to the cycle. The abuse mimics intimacy through adrenaline and cortisol. The apologies, the love bombing, the rare moments of kindness, they create a dopamine strong enough to override the pain. And even when you see the truth, your body still craves that high. That's what makes this stage so dangerous. It feels like your body is betraying you, pulling you back into a dynamic you've started to question. And at the same time, the abuser often senses that shift. They recognize you're waking up and they do everything they can to pull you back in. Promises, guilt, tears, rage. They say they've changed. They say they understand. They say this time it will be different. But nothing has changed except you. And now you're standing in the middle of the storm with your eyes finally open. You can't go back to sleep. You can't unsee the pattern. And even though it hurts, even though it feels like grief, even though every part of you wants to shut it down, something in you has shifted. And that shift is where your power begins. This is the start of the break. It may not look like strength from the outside. You may still feel uncertain, still afraid, still tethered by memory or guilt or confusion. But inside, something has shifted. You're no longer just surviving the system, you're starting to question it. And that single act, that quiet refusal to pretend, is what begins to restore you. So, what do you do when you start to wake up? Because waking up from abuse doesn't feel like a nice clean break. It feels like the bottom falling out. The certainty you once held about your relationship, your reality, your role, it dissolves. You start to see the manipulation for what it is. But with that clarity comes a wave of disorientation that cuts deeper than most people realize. You may feel rage, raw, and explosive, surging through your body like it's been waiting for years to be heard. You might feel grief, vast, numbing, heavy at the life you have lost, the life you dreamed you would have. You might feel shame, confusion, disbelief. How did I end up like this? Or you may feel nothing at all. Your emotions are disassociated. There's just a blankness, as if your entire system has gone into lockdown. For some, the silence after awakening is the loudest thing you'll ever hear. It's the sound of years of survival finally catching up to you. This is the aftermath most people don't see. From the outside, it looks like progress. You're finally recognizing the abuse. But inside, you're questioning everything. If it was really abuse, why did you stay? Why didn't you fight harder? Why do you still miss her? These questions don't mean you're wrong. They're signs of just how thoroughly your perception was shaped to serve the system. And when you finally try to speak, to share what happened, you may find your voice still doesn't land. Many abusers wear a public mask, generous, charming, socially admired. So when you say the truth out loud, people might flinch. They might downplay your story. They might defend her or suggest that you're overreacting. That dismissal stings in a different way. You're no longer just battling self doubt. Now you're also facing disbelief. Meanwhile, the abuser often senses the shift and begins their next move, what many call the Hoover. They promise change, they express remorse, they offer a glimpse of love you once believed in. The intensity returns. For a moment, you might feel that flicker of hope again. Maybe this time will be different. Maybe the pain meant something. And in that suspended space between fear and longing, a cycle tempts you back in. What follows is often a stage of relentless rumination. You begin analyzing every moment, every fight, every apology, every decision. You replay conversations in your head, hunting for signs you missed, clues you ignored. You wonder if it really was as bad as it felt. And in that spiral, you're not healing. You're still trying to make sense of something that was designed to confuse you. It's important work, but it's only one part of the journey. This is also where many survivors become obsessed with understanding the abuser. You watch every video on narcissism, read every article on coercive control, scour forums and podcasts for answers. That hunger for insight isn't just curiosity, it's a desperate attempt to rebuild a map of reality, because without it, nothing makes sense. And to some extent, that stage is necessary. It's how your brain starts reconnecting to what was denied for so long. You're finally giving yourself language for what you lived through. You're finding words that were never spoken in your relationship: manipulation, projection, gaslighting, abuse. You're starting to name the pattern, and in naming it, you begin to separate it from it. But there's also a trap here, because when you first awaken, everything can start to look like abuse. You see the tactics in old friendships, in your family, in strangers online. It feels like the mask has dropped on the entire world. And now you can't stop seeing the pattern everywhere you look. That hypervigilance isn't paranoia, it's your instincts finally turning back on. But it's also exhausting. The truth is, not every mistake is manipulation. Not every conflict is abuse. People lash out when they're stressed, they avoid when they're scared, they say things they regret. Abuse isn't defined by the worst moment, it's defined by a repeated patterned system that serves one person's control at the cost of another's autonomy. And learning to distinguish between the two is part of what comes next. As your clarity grows, so does your ability to discern. You begin to recognize the difference between a mistake and a tactic, between emotional clumsiness and calculated cruelty, between someone who's struggling and someone who's silencing you to maintain power. And that shift begins to restore your trust in your own judgment, trust that was systematically dismantled. But clarity should also bring accountability, not for the abuse that was never your fault, but the way you adapted, for the parts of yourself that helped maintain the system, not because you wanted to be harmed, but because you were doing the best you could with the tools you had at the time. Maybe you shut down instead of speaking up. Maybe you lashed out when you felt powerless. Maybe you abandoned your own boundaries to keep the peace. Maybe you learned to lie or people please or self erase. Maybe you used silence as a shield or mimicked the very behavior that hurt you, not because it felt right, but because it felt familiar. Owning these parts is not about blame, it's about growth. It's how you become someone who no longer needs to perform, disappear, or self destruct to feel safe in love. It's how you stop handing your life over to others, to patterns, to fear, and start becoming someone who lives in full alignment with your values. That doesn't mean the pain disappears or that the healing is quick, but you begin to walk a different path. You stop chasing explanation and start building clarity. You stop looking outwards for permission and start listening inwards for truth. You stop waiting to be chosen and start choosing yourself, not with arrogance, but with quiet dignity. And the more you return to that truth, the more solid it becomes. The more you listen to yourself, the more your voice comes back. The more you speak it, the more your world changes. Slowly, sometimes imperceptibly, you begin to live like someone who has nothing left to prove because you've already reclaimed what matters: yourself. If you've made it this far, you already know something most people never see. Abuse isn't always loud, it doesn't always leave bruises, and it doesn't require rage or shouting to do damage. What it needs is compliance. What it feeds on is confusion. And what it steals slowly over time is your sense of reality, your confidence, your agency, and your voice. You may not have seen it coming. You may have excused it at first. You may have blamed yourself, tried harder, bent further. But if you're here now, it means something inside you didn't fully give up. And I'm proud of that. Some part of you, however small, knew this wasn't what love was meant to feel like. That voice may have been faint, may have been buried, but it was never gone. This episode isn't about diagnosing anyone. It wasn't made to tell you how to feel or what to do. It was created to give shape to something that many men struggle to name, something that lives in the grey zones, the unspoken moments, the subtle daily undermining of your worth. We're not taught to look for these things, especially as men. We're taught to endure, to provide, to fix, to take it on the chin and keep going. And when we collapse, it's often in private, behind closed doors, under the weight of silence, unsure if what we're feeling even counts. but it does count. What you felt was real. What you experienced matters. And no matter how long it took to see it or how many times you went back, you are allowed to reclaim your life. You are allowed to heal. You are allowed to live a life that doesn't revolve around someone else's needs, moods, or control. That journey isn't easy. It will ask more of you than you expect. It will surface grief, rage, regret, shame. It will challenge every script you have been handed about love, masculinity, and identity. It will feel disorientating because you're not just walking away from someone, you're walking away from a version of yourself that thought survival was the best you could hope for. That survival is not the end of your story. You're allowed to recover, to repair what was broken, to rebuild what was lost, and to begin again, not from the ashes of who you were, but from the truth of who you are. This is the beginning of that journey. And whether you take the next step today or simply sit with this truth for a while longer, know that you are not alone. You are not broken. You are not to blame. And no matter how long you've been surviving, you are allowed to live fully, freely, and in your own voice. If this video helped you name something you've struggled to articulate, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your voice may be exactly what another man needs to hear, and your visibility helps bring this message to others who need it most. Visit standagain.com.au to explore the full blueprint and learn the 4 stages of recovery and begin reconnecting with the version of yourself you were always meant to be. And it doesn't matter how many times you've been knocked down, you can stand again.